I'm Wright Culpepper. I'm co-pastor at First United Methodist Church, and I am the father of this show, Father, Son, and Holy Guest.
And I'm Bill Culpepper. I'm the son of this show, Father, Son, and Holy Guest. Today we've got Dwight Moody coming to us. He is director of the meetinghouse.net, which is a somewhat podcast, just like we're somewhat of a podcast. And we talked to him today about C.S. Lewis, who he has been teaching about for, he said, over 30 years now.
Yeah, Bill, I found the conversation very helpful and refreshing to me. It's probably been over 45 years since I've read of any of C.S. Lewis's work. How about you?
I probably read, I think, at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the past 2 years. And the thing about Lewis is that his writings, they are so broad. You have the children's stuff. You have a science fiction trilogy that not a lot of people talk about. You have other kind of historical or Christian fiction stuff. Then you have his essays, his letters, and then you have Mere Christianity, his writings on war, his writings on grief, all these things that he's written on that people can kind of access throughout wherever they are in their life.
I dare say he's probably one of the most influential people of the 20th century, certainly, and that many people in the world of spirituality don't realize maybe how impacted they are by the thoughts and the writings of C.S. Lewis. So it's good to be reminded of that. Glad to know that that C.S. Lewis cuts across generational lines, and I think Dwight Moody did a great job of helping us be reintroduced to him.
How did you meet Dwight?
He contacted me to interview me on the meetinghouse.net show, which he has started in retirement. He moved to St. Simon's a few years ago and just very recently started the Meeting House. It's more a discussion on American life and religion. And so he talks about current events and things that are going on politically and socially in our world today, and puts a theological and spiritual spin to it all.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get into it.
But, Dwight, welcome. We're glad to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being on my radio show a couple of weeks ago. I got very good response. Several people wrote in and told me that you were clear and articulate and interesting, so that makes for a good show.
I appreciate that. It was a delight, and look forward to having other conversations with you, perhaps over time.
Good.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that you've been affiliated with Georgetown College up in Kentucky, and most of your life has been in Kentucky. But tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a native of Kentucky. I graduated from Georgetown in 1973. About 1994, I went on the Board of Trustees and served for 3 years. And then I was elected to the faculty and to the position of Dean of the Chapel. So I served 11 years back at my alma mater, teaching religion, including courses in preaching and Christian theology, and a course in C.S. Lewis. And I directed a number of programs, especially those funded by the Lilly Endowment. And then in 2008, the endowment asked me to design and launch an organization now known as the Academy of Preachers. Our mission then and now was to identify, network, support, and inspire young people in their call to gospel preaching. And we essentially had festivals for them all over the country, including many Methodist campuses and venues. We had a wonderful national festival out at Perkins School of Theology. I think that was maybe 2015. And so we would have these venues and the young people would come and preach. It was never a competition. It was an effort to try to encourage young people who were sensing a call to preach. Generally at our festivals, our national festivals, we would have generally 115, 125 young people, all of whom would preach. And then they would listen to one another preach. We put them in prayer circles. We would have trained professors and experienced pastors evaluate them and talk to them. But it was an effort to create a network. And now, as I sit at home during this great Sabbath shutdown of 2020, and I go on Facebook and YouTube, I visit many of the sites of these young people who are now pastoring churches from Maine to California, from Minneapolis to Florida. It's wonderful. We have more than 1,000 young people who have come through our program of all kinds, male, female, of all denominations, Catholic, Orthodox, Pentecostal, Protestant. It was a wonderful experience for me, and I was involved in it for a full decade, 10 years. And it's a tremendous thing. And if young people get the opportunity to attend one of these, I encourage them to do so. It's a powerful experience.
Yeah, how could they find out about them? Where would they find information to sign up for the next one?
The website has been, I'll have to put it that way, academyofpreachers.net. But last fall, we, the board, bequeathed the organization to Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I don't know, I haven't checked it in the last couple of months of whether they've incorporated that web presence into their university website or not.
So a search for Academy of Preachers or a search for Belmont University, either one should help you find it.
Right. It's not the Academy of Homiletics, which of course is for old dudes.
Right.
But the Academy of Preachers. The age range was 14 to 28. And we always had people younger and always a few a little older.
I'm much more in the homiletic camp, I think, but I'm grateful for your work with the young preachers like Bill to help move them along.
It was a terrific experience for old dudes like me to be around young people full of idealism and enthusiasm and talent and courage and conviction. It was truly a powerful experience.
Tell us what you mean by Sabbath shutdown.
Well, the pandemic, of course, has caused our whole country to shut down. And many religious people, including many ministers, have likened this to a Sabbath for all of us, of pulling in and slowing down and calming down. As a matter of fact, there have been a number of articles written about the effect on our environment, how animals have started to come out and come to places where they haven't been, how the pollution level has declined so that the images taken in space show a dramatic difference in the pollution level, especially around many of our cities. Nature is reasserting its air and clean water and the animals coming and going, even while we stay in our homes. So this is kind of a Sabbath experience for most of us. And that's what I mean by it.
I saw a picture of a jellyfish swimming in the canal
in Venice. Yes, I saw that, yeah.
You said you were a C.S. Lewis scholar, so we want to talk a little bit with you about C.S. Lewis this afternoon.
I'm glad to do that. I started reading Lewis when I was a freshman in college. I still have the book my parents sent to me, Mere Christianity, and I read a great deal. And my first trip to England during my college days, 1972, I visited some of the Lewis sites, pub where he met his friends, the college where he taught. The house that he lived in was not available for visiting then like it is now, but I did go to the church at Headington Quarry where he worshiped and visited his grave. That was all while I was in college. And then I kept reading his stuff. Fact is, I read really everything he published in the area of literature, theology, apologetics, his children's things. And then when I got to the college, they wanted me to teach a course in C.S. Lewis, which I did. And I've written several things, I've published several articles about him. And as a matter of fact, I've just finished reading and reviewing one of the new books about Lewis. It's called Becoming Mrs. Lewis, written by a woman by the name of Patty Callahan, who's going to be my guest on my radio show this week, as a matter of fact.
Good.
She's a writer in Birmingham, Alabama, and she's written this wonderful novel. It's a historical novel. She has to create a lot of events because there wasn't a lot known about Joy Davidman Gresham and her desire to meet Lewis, and finally her desire to marry Lewis. All of that is told in this wonderful brand new book called Becoming Mrs. Lewis.
Good.
I've been reading Lewis my entire life, starting with, of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is probably where I would think most people now start with, at least in their younger years. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised growing up, learning more about him, moving into college years and reading him on a different level, and all the ways that he goes about talking about Christ and talking about theology. My niece, she's 9, she just finished reading the Magician's Nephew and is moving on to The Horse and His Boy. So she's getting into Lewis. Do you think that most people now find Lewis through the children's stuff, or do you think most people go into the mere Christianity kind of route that you did?
Well, I don't know how I could answer that. Of course, we have the movies, both the animated version and the real movie version of these movies, and I think they're still being made. We also have the movie called Shadowlands, which was about the Joy Davidman story. So we have several venues now. Plus, you have this whole string of C.S. Lewis societies from New York to California of intellectuals generally affiliated with a university somewhere that use the whole C.S. Lewis persona and his corpus of writings as venues for talking about Christianity and the modern world. So there are many entry points into the whole Lewis story. My grandchildren, of course, have read and are reading or have been to them the chronicle stories, and many people keep going back to the Chronicles. They're certainly his most, I think, influential writings across the board, because they reach so many people who don't really follow through on the intellectual stuff.
Yeah, I remember being in a youth minister in Macon, and with the youth group, we went through The Great Divorce, which is one of my favorite books that he wrote, but I feel like doesn't get a whole lot of credit out there. The Great Divorce, for those of you who might not know, is basically people are put on a bus from hell over to the borderline of heaven and given a choice to go into heaven. And really some surprising stuff happens. And it all gets down into one of Lewis's things is that the main human plight, according to Lewis, is pride. Is that something that you keep coming up and seeing in his other writings?
Yes, it's something he confesses about his own journey, the amount of pride that he had to deal with in his own life. And of course, this is a prominent theme in the literature that he taught, the medieval literature that he taught at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Say, for instance, the Shakespearean literature. So it does come into his fantasy stuff. Even he deals with it even in the Narnia Chronicles. Among the children, they have to deal with their own pride, especially Edward.
What is your favorite work of Lewis?
I would say that my favorite writings of C.S. Lewis are his letters. And we're fortunate to have 3 huge volumes I've got one of them right here. This is volume 2 of the letters of C.S. Lewis. You can see how thick it is. Later on in life, in one of his letters, he describes spending 2 hours a day writing letters. And he estimated that he averaged 70 letters a day.
Wow.
Every letter that came to him. He felt it was his calling in life, one that had been thrust upon him. You know, he really wanted to be a poet. And he does have a book of poetry, some of which I like very much. And he wanted to be the professor of poetry at Oxford, but he was voted down and the position was given to another person. But this letter writing was kind of pushed upon him. It came to him unbidden, unsought, but he began to write in longhand, mostly, up to 70 letters a day. Of course, most of these letters have been lost, but thousands of them have been saved as people find them. In fact, as I have a friend in Louisville that has in his possession several original unpublished letters written by C.S. Lewis. And as a matter of fact, this new book that has just been published, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, much of it is based upon a trove of literature that Joy Davidman saved and was hidden in a closet and discovered accidentally in 2013, published in 2015, and now the basis of this new book. But I like the letters because he's unguarded, he's frank, he talks about things in his letters which he never talks about in his books, but yet he has the skill, the poetry, the imagination, the metaphors, all of that rolled into his letters. And that's what I like.
Who is he typically writing to in these letters?
Well, he had 3 or 4 pen pals that wrote all of his life. His best friend, a man by the name of Arthur Greaves, he wrote constantly, consistently all of his life. He had a friend, Ruth Pitcher, who was an English poet he has a long correspondence with. He had a student by the name of Griffiths, who became a minister that he corresponded with. And Don Griffiths, eventually wrote a book about his correspondence. But most of his correspondence, of course, he wrote Joy Davidman, whom he later married. But most of his letters were to people he did not know, who just wrote him out of the blue. He was a celebrity, of course, and people wrote him with all kinds of questions about what was going on during the war, World War II. What did he mean by this in one of his books? How can you help me solve a problem in my life? How should I interpret what's happening to me? This whole range of letters that came to him that he responded to. Some of them very intellectual, some of them very personal, some of them very general, some very pastoral. But that's my favorite stuff.
And just imagine how much we may have missed in this day and age because we don't have as many people that are able to take that kind of time to collect their thoughts and to share their thoughts. And I'm sure that every time he was writing a letter, he was thinking, okay, this is going to form the basis of a book or a story or something. So it wasn't wasted effort, but what a wonderful discipline that was for him to put into practice.
Yes, it's an amazing thing. And of course, you can see as you read his book, read his letters, the ideas that he talks about that later became books, or in some cases that had already been in his books, that he refers to again in his letters. And of course, in his letters, he will refer people to certain books that he's written or certain books that other people have written. And he encourages people to read them. This is quite common in his letters.
If you were to recommend a book for someone who has never read a C.S. Lewis book, this is their first time picking one up, what would you say would be a good starting point for someone wanting to read?
Well, a good part of that would depend on who the person is and what their situation in life is. It's always good to start with a biography. Although Lewis himself, in his essay on the reading of old books, which influenced me powerfully when I read it as a college student, he argues against reading secondary literature. That is, he was never happy with the way people were interpreting his own books. And so he was constantly encouraging people not to read the books about Plato. Go read Plato. Don't read a book about Shakespeare. Go read Shakespeare. And I took this to heart as a young man when I was in college and resolved not to read a single book about Lewis until I had read everything that he had written. And it wasn't up until that I was called upon to teach a college course that, first of all, I went back and reread a great deal that he had written, but then I read a number of biographies about him. But to answer your question, other than reading a biography, and there are many good ones, young people, of course, are going to be most interested in the science fiction, the Perelandra series, The Great Divorce, which you mentioned, even the children's Narnia Chronicles. I like these, and they are still very accessible, very, very captivating, and they usher you into Lewis's vivid imagination in very accessible ways. Certainly, one of the books that most influenced me were his books of essays, including God in the Dock. Many of these are very short essays about issues that are still pertinent to us today: evil, prayer, turmoil in the world. Books, that's where I first read his essay on the reading of old books. He has an essay called Learning in Wartime. I like the essays. He's a terrific writer. He's very brief, having read Mere Christianity, how brief these chapters are, and I like them.
You are a man of many books, I'm sure. I personally have become a man of many podcasts. I enjoy listening to podcasts whenever I'm in the car. Curious what you might be reading now or listening to now. That's the first question of our Holy Trinity.
I've just finished 2 books. One of them is the book about Mrs. C.S. Lewis, Becoming Mrs. C.S. Lewis, which I've already mentioned. The other is a book called The Green Good News: Path to Sustainable and Joyful Life, written by a young scholar. And it is about, he pushes back against a great deal in our own culture, beginning with food, how it's produced, how it's processed, how it's served and eaten. And he does it all, of course, in the context of the life of Jesus. You may know that I read and review a book a week on my own radio show, The Meeting House, and these are on my website at themeetinghouse.com. I've just started a new book called Debating Religious Liberty. Now, this was written before the coronavirus, but the coronavirus, of course, issue has intensified the debate on this religious liberty with the governor's calls everywhere for us to shut down our churches, as you all have done in Brunswick, as we have done over here on the island. But this is a collection of essays, pros and cons on how do we interpret religious liberty. But the book I'm right in the middle of is the biography of Mark Twain. Ron Powers, and I'm about halfway through. Fascinating book. First biography I've ever read about Mark Twain. I haven't read any of his books in a long, long time, since school, when we had to read Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But that's what I'm reading right now.
Great.
All right, great.
We have another question for you, and that is, in all that your work or all that you do in your life, is there any particular story from the Bible that kind of influences what you do?
Yes, I've thought about this, and I do have a story, although I will have to say that there are a lot of runners-up. The whole birth stories of Jesus, of course, are favorites of all of us. Who can put aside the stories of Jesus' death and resurrection this past Sunday? The lectionary text was the road to Emmaus, something I heard my father preach on many times. But I will have to say that my favorite story in the Bible is the story of Jesus coming into Jericho and meeting Zacchaeus and going to the home of Zacchaeus. I think it just gathers together so much of the prophetic teaching in the Old Testament about social justice with so much of the personal characteristics of Jesus, walking and coming into a village and calling a man by name, and then having sit down and having dinner with somebody, and evidently a long conversation that ended up in a change of life for his host. I just think it's a wonderful text to read. It's a wonderful text to dramatize. It's a wonderful text to preach on. And as a matter of fact, when I was young, about your age, Bill, I took it as the text for a series of sermons in a revival and preached 5 straight sermons just on that one story. And I don't think I touched half of what was there at the time. So I have to say that the Zacchaeus story is my favorite to read, to tell, and to preach on in the Bible.
So Jesus met people wherever they were and went to where they were and engaged them, and then often called them from those places and sometimes sent them back to where they were, that they could begin to tell the story and live the story there. Where do you find the presence of God?
I thought about it since you presented it to me perhaps a couple of days ago. Like a lot of people, I experience God in music, all the way from Chris Christopherson, whose music I love, to Handel, whose music I love and sing. The whole range of music with text and even instrumental music. It has a powerful impact on me. Of course, as a reader, I've always found God speaking to me through books. My whole life has been shaped by the books that I've read, beginning as a child. And we've talked about the role that C.S. Lewis and his books played in shaping my life. But I have a whole shelf in my library behind me of the books that really changed my life, in which I experienced something of the revelation and truth of God, in which my ideas were changed, my practices were moved in a new direction, my affections lit, I guess, with the presence of God. Like Jesus, like most ministers, I experience God in my encounter with other people. And this is one of the reasons why I like the Zacchaeus story. I have met people all my life, some of whom became very good friends, others were just strangers. But I've encountered in their lives elements of courage and kindness, of talent and ability, compassion, the love of God. I've had a son who has spent many years as a homeless person. And so I've gotten often have a deep encounter spiritually with homeless people when I see not only the face of Jesus, but the face of my own son in the people that I meet on street corners. And this is a very powerful experience in my own life. But I'll have to say also that I experience God in worship, especially preaching. I love preaching. I love good preaching. I tolerate mediocre preaching. I've done a lot of both in my life, a lot of marginal preaching, but preaching that is simple and strong and straightforward and full of the delight of God really touches my soul. And I'll say this as a Baptist who, walked the aisle and got immersed. Many times when I hear good preaching, I want to get saved all over again. I want to be baptized all over again. And this is a powerful experience in my own life.
Dwight, thank you so much. We're going to get cut off in just a minute. How can people find you if they want to get in touch with you?
Themeetinghouse.net. Themeetinghouse.net.
And we will put that up on air. Dwight, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Look forward to getting you back. We'll talk about religion and American life. We'll talk about mental health issues. We'll talk about all kinds of things. So we'll have you back sometime soon.
Okay. Very good.
Bless you.